So please, please, please populate the chat with what would make this worth your time. I will be paying attention to that. The other thing is there are so many friendly faces. I know so many of you. I also want to shout out Ashley Shad and Jody DeAugustine, who are on our board and our foundation over at Vera House, and very grateful for the work that they've been doing and leading in this effort. And so they also will be able to, if they're willing, be able to talk a little bit. One of the things that I know comes up is some of the conversation, particularly when we're talking about fundraising, philanthropy, is the things that have occurred publicly at Vera House in the fall of 2020. And I want you to know that I'm very open. We are all very open of talking about that at Vera House. We believe it was a very important and critical time, but that our work did not start when it hit the press. Our work had started actually years before. And it was the kind of leading up and the now work that we were pushing into in more of an intentional way that actually led us to the place where we are now. So without further ado, I will use my PowerPoint slides a little bit. I will tend to take them down for conversation. I do not like everyone looking at them. I would prefer to look at each other and be able to have conversation. I also have a small video if and when it makes sense for me to show. And so I will also do that as well. So I got my slides, and if you all, I just want to point out that you do have reactions buttons. You can raise your hand, you can put things in the chat. If I'm saying something, I can see you all. I have multiple screens, so if I'm saying something that resonates with you, please, give me a nod, give me a finger snap, whatever that might be. And for those of you who can't be on video, you can use your reaction buttons as it makes sense. So part of why I am here is to talk about our experience, but also I have a different philosophy, I think, that I hear in the mainstream. And while I think diversity, equity, inclusion, is important work, I do not believe that it gets us where we need to go. I do not believe that it moves the needle on the things that need to be happening in our organizations, in our businesses, and in our community, and ultimately our country. If it did, then diversity, equity, and inclusion work would have worked 20 and 30 years ago. And we cannot see the root, we cannot see the fruits of that work. We cannot see the impact that diversity, equity, and inclusion has truly made in civil rights and in the work for people to feel as though they're a part of a larger community. So one of the things that we use at Vera House that I always think is important, that I encourage you to take back with you, are these ideas of, in order for us to flourish and grow, in order for us to push in and do the real work, it's not as simple as a policy. That's the easy part. Policies are easy. It's not the protocols and the procedures. That's just building and creating more systems. It is the conversations, it is the creativity, it is the innovation, and it is this way of thinking outside of the traditional systems that then gets us where we need to be. And for every organization, that is different. Vera House is a different organization. The reason why we could be as vocal as we were is, one, we had a reputation that preceded the work that we were doing at the moment. We leveraged that reputation. We also have an executive director who is widely respected. Randy was able to use that respect and the reputation of the organization to take stances in ways and make positions that typically most organizations, and depending where organizations are, may not be able to do that. So this is not about, can everybody be like Vera House? And I need to say that up front. With my work with ACTS, we completely dismantled the entire structure of the organization during COVID because we felt so strongly about racism. It is not one single thing. And with ACTS, it was a very different process than it was at Vera House. And that's the beauty of it, is that you will find your way. But in order to do that, the ultimate understanding is that we all agree to be in brave space with each other. We all agree to that. We commit to be in brave space. And so what is brave space? It means we all have fragility around something. everyone comes with an angle on privilege in some way, shape, or form. So I am a cisgendered hetero female. I am Christian. I am multiracial. I am multi-ethnic. I am disabled. And I have lived rurally, urban, and suburban. Those are just some of my identities, right? In some of those places, I have privilege. Doing multiple assessments, I find out overall I'm really not privileged, but there are places where I have privilege. For me to deny the places that I have privilege is to not acknowledge that I have power. So I start by saying managing fragility, because we all have fragility around certain things. Bringing authenticity and transparency is critical. If we cannot be vulnerable together, I don't know how we do this work. Taking risks, open to accountability. We're all going to screw it up. Randy and I screwed it up last week. We all screw it up. And so when we screw it up, it really depends on how we respond to the screwing it up. Are we open to accountability? Do we publicly take accountability? Those things matter. But are we willing to acknowledge and allow mistakes? This is not about perfectionism. This is not about getting it right. This is about saying, where are we trying to go? What do we need to get there? How personally am I complicit in a system that is oppressive? What are the things that I need to do to get a handle on that, to be really open-eyed about it? And then ultimately, can I give my colleagues, my friends, my enemies, if I feel like I have enemies, the generosity of spirit? What does that mean? Brene Brown uses it and we love it, which is, can we really stop for a moment and think that not everyone is working to be malicious, not everyone is working to be harmful, that there really is something beyond us, which is this system that has socialized us to be this way. And so this is really about the unlearning and unpacking of that. And then really being able to differentiate between safety and comfort. At Vera House, this was a really big deal. We're talking about violence a lot and abuse a lot. Much of what we heard our folks say is, we're not safe in this environment to talk about that. When we unpacked it, what we found out is, it's not that they weren't unsafe, it's that they weren't comfortable. So we really had to define, what does it mean to be comfortable and what does it mean to be safe? And in brave space, you will not be comfortable, but you will always be safe. Psychologically, physically, emotionally, cognitively, all of those things matter in safety. So this presentation really is about, how do we move the needle? Can we get more people to commit to being anti-racist and to looking at how oppression shows up and harm occurs, because it's happening everywhere all the time. I really am going to spend a little bit of time talking about why DEI is not enough. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me if you're like, I'm a white knuckled human about DEI and it is the thing that's going to save us. Thank you. That is amazing. I'm going to ask you to be open to what I'm about to share with you. And then we can talk about it after. We can have real conversation about it. DEI is not enough because it does not address white supremacy and the standard of whiteness as the default. For years, people who look like me and darker, and sometimes more yellow than I, and I'm pretty yellow, we couldn't go in and find makeup that looked like us. That's a standard of whiteness. We could not find toys that represented and looked like us, and it's the larger group of us. There is a standard of whiteness. There is a standard that straight hair, that blonde hair, that blue eyes is to be coveted. And when you look at the droves of people who are either lightening their skin, having eye surgery to change the way their eyes are shaped, to begin to change how they're doing their hair, the colors that they're wearing or not, there is a standard of that. To not pay attention to that is then to not acknowledge how people have been socialized, even in media, to think about what the frame of the best body and the best way to live. And right, we used to call it way back in the day, keeping up with the Joneses. Well, who are the Joneses? I don't know, but we've all spent a lot of time trying to keep up with them. only we really don't know who they are. Diversity has never addressed inequity. Even though we say diversity, equity, and inclusion, but diversity in and of itself is never addressed that. One of the things that it's obligated and tethered to is this celebration of difference. We're not denying the celebration of difference, but we'll talk about later that does not inherently take away inequity. Diversity tolerates and promotes language and intellect, but it nowhere moves us to action and transformational change. Vera House is in for transformational change. We are not interested in just talking about and adding new language, right? So this connotation of being woke is that I know now all the language. I know to say BIPOC and AAPI. I know all the terms, and that has been my pursuit. That's not what this is about. This is about deeply living this work and having it transform us and the organizations and the services we deliver. And then that means it transforms the way we raise money. It transforms the way we ask for more money. It transforms the way in which we steward that money. Hegemony, or the dominant culture, exists above and over all diversity. And that's important. There is a system that exists that's bigger than the diversity. Even Black and brown folks must acquiesce to hegemony. That's really important. So when you start to hear, well, I heard this Black person say this, I heard this Latinx person say that, and it seems to be more dominant narrative, it's because we have to keep our jobs and feed our families, that power is so big. We have internalized oppression that, yes, oftentimes we will say and we will move in ways in which we are working to self-preserve and protect. And so that sounds very much like dominant culture. And that is even true when we are the majority and when we are leaders. So hidden rules, and when I did a lot of poverty work, I did a lot of work on hidden rules of social class and economic class, but there are hidden rules that help us to know if we belong or if we do not belong. And it does not it's a way of executing covert racism, but it also is this way that oppression plays out, right? Do I belong? Do I fit in? Is this the place for me? That to me always gets at social coherence. Social coherence is about, do I belong? Do I see myself belonging? Do I see myself as a part of this organization? What you need to know is that people who are marginalized and harmed aren't saying, oh, I'm going to go and work at this job for the next 30 years. What they're saying is, I'm going to take this job. I'm going to get whatever experience I can. I'm going to try to minimize and eliminate the harm to the best of my ability, and then I'm going to move on. It's not when we will, it's not if we will leave the organization. It's more about when we will leave. And how much harm we're enduring has a lot to do with that. So here's another piece about why DEI does not inherently mean that we're doing the work. Racial justice is not equal to diversity. Diversity is about the variety of people we have. It is not about the justice. Racial justice does not necessarily mean equality. Equality oftentimes means sameness. It means we have access to the same rights, the same privileges. That is not necessarily a justice frame. And social justice does not necessarily equal or equivalent to equity. So there's this idea around equity, around fairness. And I've always had to say, working with young people, doing case management, I've probably held almost every varying position in an organization. And the reality of it is, fair is not equal. And it shouldn't be. Because what I need to exist in a space is not the same thing that my counterpart needs to exist in the space. And when we keep thinking it's the same, we're not really looking at equity. We're really searching for this element of fairness and sameness while trying to celebrate our diversity. So I want to give us this sort of quote or this working definition for racial justice. And then I want to stop a little bit and have a little bit of a conversation, which is This working definition is that racial justice is the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, and attitudes and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, and impacts and outcomes for all. And that's that working definition. So I'm going to stop sharing for right now, and I'm curious about what you're thinking, what you're hearing from me. Talk to me.
And I'll let the folks here on this call know that when Angela says talk, you guys are welcome to unmute and toss out questions. So, Angela, what exists over and above all diversity? What is that word that was on the slide that I didn't jot down?
Hegemony?
Hegemony.
Yeah, it's the dominant culture.
Can you tell me, can you just lean into that a little bit? Because this is my first exposure to that as a concept.
Yes. I'm actually going to plop into the chat a document right now. It's loading up as a PDF. This is why I love doing Zoom, because now I can just go to my resources and be like, yeah, I'm going to pull that out and I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to drop it to you. So I just opened this Elements of White Middle Class Dominant Culture. These are the characteristics of white supremacy. So one of the things at Vera House we've used at Alliance of Communities Transforming Syracuse is looking at what are all of the ways that the dominant culture shows up. And so when we're looking at, you know, the sense of urgency, do you work in an organization, an environment where everything is a sense of urgency? That was supposed to happen yesterday. The pace is really high. When I came into Vera House, the pace was overwhelming. I don't know how anyone could work longer than 6 months without dying, because the pace, my first day of work, no one knew me, right? No one knows Angela Douglas. I show up for work. My first day, I already had 20 emails. And I was opening the email at noon and I was like, there's 20 emails and no one knows who I am. And I panicked because I was like, what's it going to be like when I've worked here for a while? Well, it means I have 300 emails, right? And spam is kicking out half of them. So I'm having to go fish and retrieve all of the time. So pace, what is the sense of urgency? And what does the sense of urgency produce? Well, often what that means is we are then not bringing the people who are affected into the conversation. It often means we are used to doing the things the same way we've always done them. It means we're not so willing to abandon practices and protocols because we get caught up in efficiently trying to get things done, but we're still not meeting the outcomes that we're wanting to meet. Or what's happening is we are creaming. Have you heard that word in nonprofits? What we're doing is we're identifying who would most be successful in our services and programs. I call them, that's the right victim. That is the right client. They're amazing. Did you see what they did? Well, they already came in with a ton of resources. You just added your service. And now we've got the spokesperson for the next 20 years about how amazing we are, right? There is this level of exploitation that sense of urgency creates in our organizations and in our work, because we're wanting to show the world we've spent your money wisely, we're doing what we said, we're impacting our mission, we're achieving our vision, and so we've got the perfect client for you so that you can see what we've done. Wow. What is that really about? Is that helpful?
It's extremely helpful. It's extremely helpful. Kelly also popped a question into the chat. She said, will you please talk a little bit about thinking in terms of DEI or DEIJ?
Yeah, so I love the slide. Let me make it concrete. I think that works better for me. Oftentimes, my experience has been for the last 20 and 30 years that diversity, equity, inclusion, which was prior affirmative action, was meant How do we obtain and recruit talent? How do we then retain talent? And then I guess we have to promote some talent. And it all became about representation. Well, what does that mean? It means there aren't many seats, so we're all competing, right? Black, brown, Asian American, Latinx, disabled, we're all competing for these very limited spaces because representation has often been equivalent to tokenism. We need you to represent us, right? I've worked with nonprofits for years, and we would always do the board grid of who's on our board, who we need. Well, we need a Black, we need an Asian, and yeah, we need someone with a disability. Oh, by the way, do you know anybody who's LGBTQ? Because we need to fill that role too, right? So we become commodified, we become tokenized. We're not really there to really give voice and participate in shifting. We are there to be representative of, which is why I will always say representation is not enough. It's not that representation doesn't matter, right? Seeing a Barack Obama or a Kamala Harris, wow, that's amazing. But guess what? It didn't tip the scales on civil rights and social justice. So DEI and representation is not enough. And it also then means there is something more at work. If it was just a matter of flipping and saying, we're going to give more money to people who don't have it, or we're now going to give access and leadership roles to people who didn't have it, you'd still get the same thing. Why? Because the system, the dominant culture, excuse me, still exists. The social norms and the mental models around who has power, why they have power, and what's acceptable to do with power always shapes. And DEI isn't always getting at power, and justice work always is looking at power. Is that helpful? Any other questions or thoughts? I think I'd like to show a video first, if you all are okay with that. I'd like to show this video that talks about intersectionality, which also I think diversity, equity, inclusion work doesn't get it intersectionality. And it'll give you, this is sort of just a brief definition of that. If you can give me a thumbs up, meaning you can hear and see the video, okay, once it starts, that will be hugely helpful to me.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Okay, what are your thoughts? What comes to mind?
I was going to say, I'm trying to give time to other folks because I am well aware that I can be a bit of a loudmouth. But really in watching that, Angela, at David's Refuge, we look at intersectionality very frequently since, you know, the families that we serve have an individual that has a disability in the home. And there are oftentimes multiple factors that change what that looks like for those families. Individuals who are Black and have, let's say, autism are viewed differently oftentimes culturally than white children with autism. And so for us, it's first being aware of, to even be able to lean in and say, okay, are the services that we're providing equitable based off of all of these different factors? So I really appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Katie said she wants to watch the video 5 more times.
Of course. Of course. Anybody else have a thought or a question, comment, concern about that? So intersectionality is happening in our midst right now. If you are familiar with what happened in Atlanta with the Asian women being murdered, that is intersectionality. I don't care what the media says. It's about race. It's about female identity. It's about the perception of sex work. It's about a perception of where that work happens. It's about misogyny, right? That's intersectionality. What it means is when we show up into a space, it is not part of us that shows up. And what I would say is, in dominant culture, the expectation is that only part of you shows up. That's the expectation. It is never spoken about. So when I go into a space, so Vera House does a lot of fundraising. You all know that. I was asked to go to a fundraiser locally and be one of the folks. I am also a victim or survivor. Could I also share my story? I am also a staff person. When I went to this community, and we had to come in and bring all of our things, and Cindy Britz is our development director, and everyone said, oh, how wonderful and great, and this is amazing. And in the beginning, there was a little food and conversation, and then the program would happen later. One of the things that occurred was people were asking me, so Angela, so you work at Vera House? I said, yes, I do. So what do you do? Well, I'm the associate director there. Oh, wow, really? That seems like a very big job. Do you know how many times I heard that? Probably 5 in an hour. And I thought, gee, do they tell Cindy Britz, wow, being the development director of Vera House is a really big job? Probably not. Then after I was part of the program, I shared my truth about my experience and that of my daughter. And afterwards, I had people come up to me and say, wow, I thought you were just here to help put things together and put things up. I didn't know that you were the speaker. That's oppression. And what I knew I had to do to survive in that experience is I had to lean into my intellect and my profession to appear middle class so that people would appreciate me more and lessen the harm. That's why intersectionality matters. It's because people like me and others cannot fully bring themselves to the work, to the place, to the conversation. So even when you have clients don't get to really say to you, wow, these are all of the parts of me that are struggling and being harmed with receiving your service. I really should just be grateful that you offered me this service because it meets one part of my life. But the other part of my life gets complicated and it makes it hard for me to show up. So when I'm seen as resistant to receiving your services, or I'm seen as not being compliant, or I am seen as not really taking advantage or being the successful client, oftentimes if we dig deeper into that, it's about the intersectionality, right? So one of the things that Ashley and I were talking about in her work, that's around addiction, right? That brings disability. If you bring in co-occurring disorders, and now we're talking about mental health, now we're talking about physical, now we've got comorbidity. Wow, how does that, so are we creating an intersectional plan for your life and goals, or are we only addressing that single issue? That's intersectionality working out all of the time. Is that more helpful and bringing it to practicality? All right. Am I overwhelming you all? I can't tell. Okay.
I'm not.
Sometimes oh, sorry. Go ahead, Christine.
No, I was going to say I'm not overwhelmed, but the way that you simplify these big concepts and put them into practice, my brain just keeps thinking and I jot different things down. I mean, the question of are we meeting your whole life and not just a certain part of you is a really interesting question to unpack with the people that we serve. So that's where my brain was.
And it would absolutely mean then that collaboration now took on a different meaning and had to happen in a different way. Because if we really were to look at our community's outcomes about our work, it would mean we'd have to be doing it together. So this other really dominant culture thing in the narrative is around individualism as opposed to collectivism. Minorities, whatever the word you want to give to us, those most marginalized, underrepresented, we are seen as part of a collective. Right? So when my kids would go into the store, I would say to my son, we trained him literally at 2 and 3 years old, when you go into a store, you put your hands in your pocket and you don't touch anything. Why? Why did we teach him that? I know it's not rhetorical because I want it to be said.
I'll say it for you, Angela. You taught him that because you're fearful you would get accused of stealing.
Correct. Correct. And I didn't teach that to my females, to my daughters. Right? So intersectionally, my son was cute until he hit puberty. But regardless of that, his hands had to stay in his pockets because the prejudice, the stereotypes that he would be stealing overarched, the dominant culture overarched and really impacted the way we parented. Right? And so what does that mean? It means then that people then take on behaviors. My husband or my son said to me, Mom, I still go into the store and put my hands in my pockets and then I remember that I'm an adult now. Right? But that's the way of protecting. So think about how those things show up in lots of ways and in other ways, right? This is the work that we are doing. And I want to bring back up my slides. So if we're going to do work, if we're going to be able to move beyond just this luxury of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I believe that's a place of privilege. If that's where your organization has to start, do it. Do it. I don't care where you start, just do it. But if we're really going to make changes, racism is the one thing that actually particularly has to dismantle white supremacy and whiteness as the standard. Being queer and transgender does not have to attack whiteness. Disability does not have to attack whiteness or anti-Blackness. That's why this matters. So Ibram Kendi, who I adore, and if you don't know, I had this wonderful privilege through Focal to be able to interview Ibram. So the only way to undo racism is to constantly identify it, describe it, and then dismantle it. Those three things matter. Identify it, describe it, and then dismantle it. Because white supremacy and whiteness it's always transforming itself. It's coded. There's lots of coded words. Here's the other thing I will say. This is a very painful process. Once you see, you cannot unsee. I get people yelling at me all the time. I will get screaming text messages. Thank you so much. You've made it so I cannot not see this anymore. And now I can't even go out to do simple things. I'm sorry, but at the same time, this is what people are living with every day. We don't get to put it away. We don't get to not listen. We don't get to, there is no place of solitude. One of the things that I came to deal with and recognizing at Vera House, and I'm writing an op-ed that someday will not be too painful for me to publish, which is racism and white supremacy are the abuser I can never escape. There is no there is no underground railroad. There is no path out. There is no witness protection program. There is nowhere that I can escape it. This is also really important, and it's going to set up these next couple of slides. Could I have someone read it so I just am not hearing me?
All right, I'll go ahead. Angela, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us.
That is powerful. It's not just in white people. It is in all of us. And I thank Matt for being courageous and reading that, right? There is a piece of the oppressor in every single one of us. It is how we have been socialized. So what does this mean? So I love this. I've been doing work on mental models for probably about 20 years now. Here's what happens in your organization or your business or your group or your family or something. There's this event that occurred. At Vera House, it was the event where we had victims and survivors and staff members participating in a Dale Carnegie workshop series that was offered to us free of charge. It was an amazing gift to the organization. It had been done for years. In that event of that taking place, the teacher, who was a former victim, who gave this as a donation to the organization, there then became a pattern of harm that was happening to the victims and survivors and staff of color in that space. So eventually it became so painful that other folks, it was really the Black folks and the brown folks and the indigenous folks who wound up trying to speak out and say something about the harm that was happening to them. All of their white colleagues, victims, survivors said nothing and were complicit. That information came back to myself. I brought it to Randy. Randy and I talked about it. Randy pushed in with the instructor. The instructor refused to change the way they were delivering the material, refused to acknowledge what was happening and the trauma that was occurring, both for the white staff and the Black, Brown, and Indigenous staff that were in that space. And so we had to say, we will never send anyone else to your program again until this is changed. Now, that could have remained an event. Randy said, Angela, what do we do? And I said, well, you addressed it. You can say that's enough and we can move on and pretend it never happened. Or we can start to do the work that's necessary, because we had staff who participated in that and they did not stand up. They did not do what an ally and a bystander does. And now we talk about this all the time. Be a bystander. Don't commit or condone abuse. But when we talk about race, somehow all of that goes out the window. And so what we then decided to do 3.5 years ago is dive into the work of pushing down, looking at what are the patterns, what are the trends, what are we noticing, what are our structures, how are they upholding this, and then ultimately looking at what are the mental models, what are the assumptions, what is the system, what is the thinking that's keeping this in place. Last year, one of the greatest things that had happened was in our movement, the sexual violence, domestic violence movement was created and fostered and moved by white feminists who were intentional about leaving out Black and Indigenous women. There was finally a reckoning of that, and there finally was something written that articulated that. That was like pulling the scab off the wound that had never healed. And in our field of work, that was huge. And so it then led us to say, now we can begin to do the work of dismantling the inherent racist and white supremacist foundations of the movement of domestic violence and sexual assault, and how that's impacted the design and the work of the organization. That's what created the great big friction at Vera House in the fall. One of the things that becomes critical is to recognize that there are stages that everybody's going to work through. We all start in a state of denial. We then move into polarization, being defended, reversing. Have you ever heard it's reverse racism? Now, and we've had people in our organization say, I don't think I can work here anymore because I'm not going to have to sit here and feel guilty about being white. That's what this is. Okay? We didn't relent. We pushed in. We tried to talk about it, discuss it in other ways. What we found as an entire organization is that as an organization, we minimized the impacts of racial harm. We minimized harm, period. And so now the organization is moving, and as individuals, we're moving to get to acceptance and adaptation. Just because you are counted as one of those who are a minority, underrepresented, BIPOC, AAPI, whatever label you choose to live by or given to us, does not mean that we have accepted and adapted. We have merely survived. So in order for this to really work, investments need to be made in your organization into the people who don't look like you, so that they can do the work of healing and dismantling the internalized oppression that has affected them. So what does it mean? I love this. Pro-Inspire produced this piece about awake, to woke, to now let's do the work. And so it's all of these levers, all of these pieces that really get us to racial equity, right? There isn't anybody who gets left out. So awake means wow, now I'm really noticing. Again, this focusing on representation, DEI. Woke means now we're recognizing the culture. culture of the organization, culture of people. And now what's the work? The work is about being accountable. The work is about transformation. The work is about the dismantling. You're not going to start out dismantling. Remember, Ibram Kendi said, we're going to identify it. Do you spend time identifying it? Then once you identify it, can you describe it? Then once you describe it, now let's do the work of dismantling it. What will it require? These things: strategic action, leadership commitment. You can't do this if your leaders do not commit. Cannot, won't work. I will also say that there's got to be transparency, and it's not up here. Board ownership. The board, the governance board has to lead. They have to own it. This is part of their responsibility. They can't just abdicate it to the work of the executive leaders of the organization. That's not fair. It's a heavy lift. You need a board that's also representative of those who you were trying to serve. Anticipate and embrace resistance. It's going to happen. There's going to be fragility. People are going to get defended. They're going to want to polarize. They're going to want to reverse. I call those the most horribly beautiful moments. They're defining moments. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have a direction, and you've got to have some priorities set. And then the biggest thing is being accountable. Are you willing to say, wow, I screwed that up? All right, let's go back and rethink that. Okay, what do I need to own it that I did that wrong and that I made this mistake. Are you okay with that? That's a lot about our own character and our own integrity. And then ultimately, are you building into this process resiliency building and self-care? This is emotionally exhausting. I had to go back to therapy. Most of my colleagues have gone back to therapy. Okay, that's how deep and hard the work is. And I want to go back to, it's all about social coherence. Can we all belong in the system together? And do we see that? Do we see ourselves together? So here are the commitments that we all need to make practically. What will we unlearn? When will we speak up? How will we use our power? And where will we begin? That's all that matters. It doesn't have to be big and grandiose. It's better if it's not public. It's just a matter of, is it happening? And are you able to talk about it? And so having a DEI committee is great, but what's the work that's happening in the organization, not in that committee? So I'm going to stop there for questions, thoughts. I've given you a lot.
Angela, I'll start. Thank you so much. You have given us a lot, but I feel like it was a jam-packed hour of learning, and now I'll go through all my notes and process. But the slide that resonated with me the most was the awake to woke to work slide, because it really allowed me to see where our organization is. And yes, we've started, but we're still in the awake, right? And setting up the strategic plan and preparing to do the work, but we're definitely still in awake. So I think all the additional materials that you've provided have given me a way to take it back to our committee that we do have and share with them more ways to move toward woke. So thank you so
Awesome.
much.
I'm glad that was helpful. And they have a whole report. If you want it, Ashley, I can send it. Thoughts, questions, concerns? What are you rumbling with? What is hard?
Angela, you and I have talked about this a little already, but for our organization, if there was this, to the honesty point, if there was a stage before awake, that would be where we are. And I think one of the things that I've struggled with, and I've talked to you about this, is language. That's where I stop myself and like, oh, that's not the right word. And one of the things you've taught me is don't worry about the exact word you use, because we can fix that. It's really sort of the intent of how you're using it, because we're doing some of this work or beginning some of this work. And, you know, when you and I talk, we call it anti-racism work, but we have people in our organization who those words mean they're checking out of this conversation. They're not going to hang around to hear what the next step is. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the words we use and when we are there places where we should be careful, or should we just jump right in?
Yeah, I think that is such an important conversation, right? So while language matters, we can't perfect it because it's changing all of the time. In an organization, and I'll use Vera House as an example, we just reviewed in our State of the Agency report, the language that we started out, I knew anti-racism, I wasn't even ready to do anti-racism work and name it that way 3.5 years ago. So in our strategic direction, it was, we were going to focus on the underrepresented, our underrepresented communities and clients. That was the way we framed it. And that was really comfortable for folks. It allowed us to get into the work and dig in a little bit. But coming into the 3rd year of our strategic plan is where we said we will dismantle the inherent racist and white supremacist foundations of the organization and the work. That meant we had evolved. You've got to be okay starting where you are and starting where people are. Now, here's where it gets hard. The leaders are both informal and formal, have to be the ones who are willing to push the conversations to the edges. Are you so caught up in the niceties of the words that you're not willing to name the thing what it really is? When you catch yourself dancing around that, then you've got to say, okay, wait a minute, I'm getting hung up again. Can we just name it? I think this is racism. And then let's talk about it. Maybe it's more intersectional than that. But this idea, you don't want to get straitjacketed by language. You also want to have a pulse on how long people have to be comfortable before they're ready to move to the next thing. And you actually got to be ahead of that curve. So Randy and I were always ahead of everyone else. We were working through things ahead. But that made it a lot easier to bring people along. So you also have to recognize that you and a group of your colleagues are saying, we're going to dig in more, we're going to dig in more, we're going to dig in more. And it creates a frustration. So the other thing, Matt, I know we've talked about is it's easy to get frustrated. Like, why aren't you all here yet already? Right? And let me remind people, this has been around this country for more than 400 years, right? People are always referring to the original sin as slavery. The original sin of this country is we completely demolished and colonized an entire country thinking that we founded it. That's the original sin. That created a pathway to make further colonization and slavery okay. So if it's that long that this has been going on, why suddenly do we get impatient? Here's the other thing I will say. White folk in the room. This is important. You didn't hear anything else I said. You're going to get angry. You're going to get frustrated. You too will be defended sometimes. Here's what I need you to know. You cannot be more emotionally charged, frustrated, and angry at your colleagues, at your leaders, at your whomever, your board, than the Black and Brown and Latinx and Asian folks are, and the disabled. But you just can't, right? So we had to have a conversation about that. We got off a meeting, it was horrible. And I had a lot of my white counterparts like, oh my God, and I can't believe this. And I'm like, how are you all more angry than me? Right? Because what happens is then that shifts and centers you and your emotional impact rather than all of the folks who were really harmed in that meeting. That's learning. It's growth. So can you do that together and not doing it with Black and brown folks? And you then will find a place where you're able to say, yeah, I was really angry about that. Let me hear how that impacted you, right? So this, what are you centering? What are you giving time, effort, and energy to? And then how are you venting about it? And how are you doing your own self-care around it? And you will be tempted to want to either fire everybody who doesn't think like you, or you will be tempted to want to like blast their face off. It's okay to feel that way. Most of us have been feeling that way about most folks most of our lives. But it's not going to get us where we want to be and where we need to be. But we also don't want to be so tone police and saying we're not going to do the identity politics, right? When I hear that, I'm like, whoa, are you kidding me? You're doing identity politics all the time. Is that helpful? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Angela. I know that some folks have other meetings, and so I will offer everyone thanks for joining. If you need to hop off, you can feel free, but Angela has graciously said that she can extend for probably another 15 minutes. Correct me if I'm wrong, Angela.
So about 125.
I did also want to share a question from Kelly. How do you recommend organizations balance work that happens in the DEI committee versus work that happens in the organization as a whole? I can tell you like that question.
I do, because if your DEI committee isn't affecting the entire organization, then why do you have it? Ultimately. So there's got to be real work that happens individually and collectively in that group, and that it has to mean something tangible for the rest of the organization. How are you taking what's happening in that committee and how are you moving it to other places and spaces? And this is where I like the term champion team as opposed to a DEI committee, because I feel like it gets hamstrung in there. You're supposed to be a champion of this work. Are you creating other champions? Are you converting? You know, there are hostages, there are volunteers and cheerleaders when we're talking about org change, and then there's saboteurs. I always say, don't pay attention to the saboteurs. They've always probably been miserable. They've always probably tried to undermine most of the good things the organization was doing. So ignore them. But are you going after, it's easy to have the cheerleaders, people who think like you know, they think the same things, they talk like you, that's easy. I'm not interested in those. I'm interested in the hostages. I'm interested in the people who want to do the right thing, don't know how to do the right thing. And so is your committee, your champion team actually thinking about how do we get their voice? How do we help them to understand? Here's the other thing. All change management, I don't care what it is. If it's an IT thing, if it is a service delivery thing, if it's a curriculum thing, if it's a racial equity thing, if it does not solve real problems of the organization, it's a waste of your time, period. Period. If it does not functionally, operationally solve problems, you're never going to get people to buy into it. Right? So within 3.5 years, our hiring practices changed significantly. We were always having Black and Brown and Latinx folks work in our organization. They just weren't staying. So we stopped thinking about what are all the bells and whistles, and we started thinking about how does the organizational culture change? And how do we hold people accountable to the organizational culture so that people who are Black, Brown, disabled, queer, that they want to stay working here? The goal for Vera House is to be one of the top 5 chosen places in this community to work. You want to work there because it's safe, because you will be able to lead, to support, to grow, to develop, and give the best of what you've got. And you will not be hindered, and there will be active work to not harm. And when harm occurs, you are very comfortable that the organization, the systems of the organization, and the leaders will take it seriously and will act on it. That's why due process matters, right? One of the things that came up in our organization, right? People always talk to us about sexual harassment, particularly now with the governor and the allegations. We never felt like people should always be fired for sexual harassment. It happens on a continuum. So when we started doing sexual harassment work, even long before the compliance law came out, we kept saying to folks, it happens on a spectrum. That you have to deem what behaviors for your organization means termination, and then what are your other interventions along the continuum. It is the same thing for all other discrimination. I had the HR manager consultant that we hired come in a middle of a room and put her hands all in my hair and spend time talking to me. She physically put her hands on me and going to town in my hair. That's the HR person. We didn't terminate her, but we had to have conversations. And here I was thinking, you work for HR. Don't you know that you don't touch women's hair, particularly black, brown women's hair? You don't touch our, no, she didn't know that, right? There was an assumption, you do HR, you would know. No, she didn't know. But we didn't terminate her and we didn't end the contract. We had to be willing to push it and have different conversations. One of the elements of dominant culture that I think gets in the way a lot is avoidance of conflict. Most people do not feel adequate to deal with the conflict, with the confrontation. There's a wonderful video by Sonia Renee Taylor. It's got some language in it if that's a trigger for you. She talks about the difference between calling on, calling out, and calling in. And you've got to know which it is you're doing, right? Weinstein needed to be terminated and he needed to lose everything. That needed to happen. Matt Lauer needed to lose everything. But that's not true for everybody all the time, everywhere. Cancel culture is a thing. There is a time when it's important. If we thought, you know, one of the things during the uprisings over the summer, it was just like, why are people looting and why are they burning down buildings and why this and that? And I was like, because when we sat at the table with you and we talked about how difficult things were and the changes we needed to see, I'm sorry, did you pay attention? Were you listening? No one was paying attention. When I say it in my very appropriate dominant culture voice, using all of the language that you're comfortable with and that you want to hear, you will still find reasons to invalidate what it is I'm saying. So what does righteous anger look like? Oh, you want it to look like the way that you're comfortable with. So when Rhinehouse went and shot up people at the Black Lives Matter rally, that was okay for you. That worked. It was good. This young man who committed these murders in Atlanta, he just had a sexual addiction problem. He was really frustrated. He was on the edge. Wow. Okay. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, the list goes on and on. I don't think they ever had an opportunity to just be on edge and so angry and frustrated that they could conduct themselves in a way. They were murdered and they didn't act that way. Is all of that making sense and tying things together? Other questions, thoughts? I want to know what you're rumbling with. I want to know what's really hard.